Welcome to Sinister Stories, where the shadows hold more than just secrets. If you're a fan of the dark and the twisted, you're in the right place. Tonight, we dive into a tale that will send chills down your spine. Before we begin, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already, so you don't miss a single spine-tingling story. Brian adjusted the sight on his AR-15, letting the weight of the rifle settle comfortably in his hands. The sun hung high in the sky, casting a warm glow over the secluded shooting range. His three military buddies, Tony, Marcus, and Jake, were scattered around the range, each in their own zone of friendly competition. "Hey, Brian!" Tony shouted, flipping his ball cap backward. "You ready to lose this round? I'm about to hit the bullseye from 50 yards. "Dream on, man," Brian retorted, grinning. He watched Tony take his position, his stance solid and practiced. With a deep breath, Tony fired, the sharp crack of the rifle echoing through the woods. "Bullseye!" Marcus called from behind a spotting scope. "Man, you're on fire today!" The group burst into laughter, the camaraderie thick in the air. They'd been doing this annual range day for years, catching up on each other's lives and reliving old military stories. Today was no different. They competed to see who could draw their pistols and fire the fastest, who could hit moving targets with the most accuracy, and who could rack up the highest score on the range. By the time the sun began to dip below the horizon, they were all worn out, but buzzing from the day. "Let's head back to my place," Brian said, slinging his rifle over his shoulder. "I've got burgers and beers waiting." Back at Brian's house, the smell of sizzling bacon cheeseburgers wafted through the air. The grill smoked as Brian flipped the patties, his golden retriever, Max, watching intently from the porch, tail wagging in anticipation of scraps. The four men gathered around the patio, beers in hand, laughing as they swapped stories of their time away from each other. "Remember that time in Afghanistan when Marcus tried to sweet-talk the colonel's daughter?" Jake asked, nearly choking on his beer from laughter. Hey, let's not bring that up," Marcus protested, though he couldn't help but laugh. Plates piled high with burgers and chips sat on the table as they dug in. The night was perfect, a crisp breeze, the occasional chirp of crickets, and the glow of string lights hung around the patio. It felt like nothing could go wrong. As they finished their meals, the radio inside Brian's house crackled to life. At first, it was just static, and then the ominous tone of an emergency broadcast pierced the air. "This is an emergency alert. Stay indoors. The Coast Guard has confirmed a massive unidentified ship has landed on the coast, and alien beings are hunting humans. I repeat, stay indoors and stay quiet." The men froze, the gravity of the announcement sinking in. The broadcast repeated once more before fading back to static. Did that just say aliens?" Jake asked, his voice incredulous. Brian's expression hardened as he set down his beer. He looked at his friends, the determination in his eyes unmistakable. "It's our time to shine, boys." "Hell yeah," Tony said, already on his feet. "Let's gear up." They moved quickly, transforming Brian's garage into a makeshift armory. Their military experience meant they were prepared for almost anything. Rifles, pistols, and even a few grenades from Tony's private collection were laid out on the workbench. Brian tossed flak vests to everyone, and they loaded magazines in silence, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. "You really think this is real?" Marcus asked, checking the chamber of his pistol. Brian shrugged. "Real or not, we're not sitting around waiting to find out. If people need help, we're going to give it to them." Outside, the distant sound of sirens filled the air. The night was no longer serene. There was a tension, an eerie stillness between the sounds, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Max barked suddenly, standing at attention near the door. Jake peered out the window and cursed under his breath. "Something's out there," he said. Brian grabbed his rifle and nodded to the others. "Let's move." They piled into Brian's truck, an old but reliable Chevy Silverado. The bed was packed with gear, and Tony rode shotgun with a map of the town spread across his lap. Marcus and Jake sat in the back, their rifles at the ready. As they drove through the darkened streets, the scale of the chaos became clear. Abandoned cars littered the road, some still running with doors ajar. Houses were dark, windows shattered, and in the distance plumes of smoke rose into the night sky. Brian slowed the truck as they passed a grocery store. The windows were smashed, and the parking lot was eerily empty. "Wait," Marcus said, pointing. "Over there." Near the edge of the lot, a group of people huddled behind an overturned shopping cart. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide with fear. Brian stopped the truck and rolled down the window. "Hey, you folks need help?" Before they could answer, a guttural screech cut through the air. From the shadows, a towering figure emerged, its body sleek and metallic, its movements unnervingly fluid. It wasn't human. "Get in the truck!" Brian shouted to the group, already raising his rifle. The survivors scrambled toward the truck as the creature charged. Brian fired the first shot, the crack of the rifle splitting the night. The rifle's shot hit the creature square in the chest, but instead of crumpling to the ground, it only stumbled back, emitting a shrill, mechanical screech. Its sleek, metallic skin reflected the truck's headlights, and its glowing eyes locked onto Brian. "Damn thing's not going down!" Brian yelled, firing another round. Tony leaned out of the truck window, AR-15 in hand, and joined the barrage of fire. Sparks flew as the bullets impacted the creature's body, but it kept advancing, undeterred. "Headshots!" Marcus shouted, aiming carefully from the back seat. His shot struck the creature's glowing eye, and it finally crumpled to the ground, its limbs twitching violently. "Go! Go! Go!" Tony barked, waving the group of survivors into the truck bed. As the last person climbed in, the creature let out a piercing, distorted wail. It sounded less like a cry of pain and more like a signal, a warning to others. "Get us out of here, Brian!" Jake yelled, slamming the truck bed shut. Brian floored the gas, the tires screeching as they sped out of the parking lot. In the rearview mirror, he saw more figures emerging from the shadows, their metallic bodies glinting under the pale moonlight. The truck roared down the empty streets, weaving around abandoned cars and debris. The survivors in the truck bed clung to whatever they could as Brian pushed the vehicle to its limits. "We need a plan," Tony said, gripping the dashboard. "We can't just drive around aimlessly." "There's a fire station on Pine Street," one of the survivors said, her voice trembling. "They were setting up a shelter there before everything went crazy." Brian nodded. "Pine Street it is. Hold on tight." As they approached the station, the scene was grim. The large bay doors were open, but inside was chaos. Several vehicles were overturned, and the area was littered with debris and what looked like parts of the creatures. "What the hell happened here?" Marcus muttered, scanning the area with his rifle. "Looks like they put up a fight," Jake said, hopping out of the truck as they came to a stop. The group cautiously entered the station, weapons raised. Inside, it was eerily quiet. The only sound was the faint hum of fluorescent lights flickering above. "Clear the area," Brian ordered, signaling for Tony and Marcus to check the back rooms. As they moved through the station, they found signs of a brutal struggle, bullet casings scattered across the floor, bloodstains smeared along the walls, and several fire axes abandoned near the entrance. "No bodies," Tony said, returning to the main bay. "Where the hell is everyone?" "Maybe they didn't make it," Marcus replied grimly. Suddenly, a low growl echoed from the shadows. The group froze, their weapons trained on the direction of the sound. From behind an overturned fire engine, another creature emerged, but this one was different. It was bulkier, its metallic frame covered in jagged spikes. Its glowing eyes pulsed like a heartbeat, and its clawed hands flexed as it let out a deep guttural roar. "Contact!" Brian shouted, firing the first shot. The creature moved with terrifying speed, dodging the initial volley of bullets. It leapt onto the hood of the fire engine, crushing the metal beneath its weight. "Spread out!" Tony yelled, tossing a flashbang toward the creature. The grenade detonated with a deafening bang, blinding the creature momentarily. Brian seized the opportunity, firing a shot that tore through its pulsing eye. The creature screeched and stumbled, but it wasn't down yet. "Marcus, Jake, flank it!" Brian barked, reloading his rifle. The two men moved quickly, firing in controlled bursts as the creature thrashed wildly. Tony grabbed an axe from the wall and charged, swinging it with all his strength. The blade bit deep into the creature's neck, severing a bundle of glowing wires. The creature let out one final distorted wail before collapsing in a heap of sparking metal. "Holy hell," Jake panted, leaning against the wall. "These things just don't quit." After securing the station, the group regrouped in the main bay. The survivors were shaken but grateful, huddling together as Brian and his friends discussed their next move. "We can't stay here," Tony said, pacing. "That thing was bad enough, but what if there are more like it?" "There are," Marcus said, pointing out the window. In the distance, several glowing figures could be seen moving through the streets, their mechanical bodies eerily silent as they hunted. "We need to get these people to safety," Brian said, his voice firm. "There's got to be other shelters around the city." "I heard on the radio earlier," one of the survivors said. "There's a church downtown. They were turning it into a safe zone." "Then that's where we're going," Brian said. "Gear up. We're not leaving anyone behind." As they loaded back into the truck, the group prepared for what lay ahead. Brian could feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on him, but he refused to let it show. "Whatever these things are," he said, looking at his friends, "we're not going down without a fight." The truck rumbled to life and they set off into the night, ready to face whatever horrors awaited them. The truck's headlights cut through the darkness as Brian and his crew barreled toward the downtown church. The city was unrecognizable. Cars were abandoned in the streets. Windows of shops and homes were shattered, and a faint haze lingered in the air. The eerie silence was broken only by the occasional metallic clank in the distance, a sound that now set everyone on edge. "I don't like this," Marcus said, his hands gripping his rifle tightly. "Feels like we're walking into a trap." "Stay sharp," Brian replied. "If these things want to fight, we'll give it to them." As they approached the church, they could see faint lights glowing from inside. People were gathered, their faces pale with fear. A few men stood outside armed with hunting rifles and shotguns, their eyes scanning the area nervously. "Looks like we're not the only ones fighting back," Tony said with a smirk. Brian pulled the truck up to the entrance, and the group quickly unloaded, helping the survivors inside. One of the armed men approached, his face lined with exhaustion. "Name's Earl," he said, extending a hand. "We've been holding this place down, but those things have been getting closer every hour." "We've seen them too," Brian said. "We're military, came to help." Earl nodded grimly. "We've got about 30 people here. Supplies are running low and morale's even lower. If you've got a plan, now's the time." Brian glanced at his friends, then back at Earl. "First, we fortify this place. Then we figure out how to hit those things where it hurts." The group quickly got to work. Tony and Marcus reinforced the doors and windows with whatever they could find, pews, tables, and even sections of broken fences. Jake helped Earl and the other defenders set up a perimeter, marking choke points and escape routes. Inside, Brian took stock of their weapons and ammunition. Between the survivors and his crew, they had a decent arsenal: hunting rifles, shotguns, a few pistols, and plenty of ammunition. But they'd need more if they were going to hold their ground. "How long do you think we can last here?" Marcus asked, joining Brian at the makeshift armory. "Long enough to figure out where these things are coming from," Brian said, loading a fresh magazine into his AR-15. Before Marcus could reply, a blood-curdling scream echoed from outside. Everyone froze as the sound cut through the air. Earl burst into the room, his face pale. "They're here," he said. The defenders rushed to their positions as the metallic clanking grew louder. Outside, dozens of the creatures emerged from the shadows, their glowing eyes casting an eerie light. They moved with unsettling precision, their bodies sleek and inhumanly fast. "Light 'em up!" Brian shouted. Gunfire erupted as the defenders opened fire, the muzzle flashes illuminating the darkness. The first wave of creatures fell, sparks flying as bullets tore through their metallic frames. But more kept coming, climbing over the fallen and advancing relentlessly. "These things just don't stop," Jake yelled, reloading his rifle. "Headshots or nothing," Tony shouted, dropping one of the creatures with a perfectly placed shot. One of the creatures leapt onto the barricade, slashing wildly with its clawed hands. Brian fired 3 quick shots, blowing its head apart before kicking its lifeless body back into the horde. "We need to hold the line," Brian yelled. Despite their best efforts, the creatures began to breach the defenses. One of them smashed through a window, its razor-sharp claws slicing through a defender before anyone could react. Marcus swung the butt of his rifle, knocking the creature back before finishing it with a shot to the head. "Fall back to the sanctuary," Earl shouted, ushering the survivors deeper into the church. Brian and his crew held the rear, covering the retreat as the creatures poured into the building. The defenders set up a final barricade at the sanctuary doors, their guns trained on the approaching horde. "This is it," Brian said, his voice steady. "We hold them here, or we die trying." The creatures charged, their glowing eyes flickering like fireflies. The defenders opened fire, the deafening roar of gunfire echoing through the sanctuary. One by one, the creatures fell, but the cost was high. Several defenders were dragged down, their screams cut short as the creatures tore into them. As the battle raged on, Tony had an idea. "I've got C4 in the truck," he shouted over the chaos. "If we can lure these bastards outside, I can blow them to hell." Brian nodded. "Do it! Marcus, Jake, cover him!" Tony sprinted to the truck, dodging the creatures as Marcus and Jake laid down suppressing fire. He grabbed the explosives and rigged them to a remote detonator before tossing the bundle into the middle of the horde. "Clear out!" Tony yelled, running back to the sanctuary. The defenders fell back as Tony hit the detonator. The explosion shook the building, sending a shockwave through the air. The creatures were torn apart, their metallic bodies reduced to smoldering heaps. As the dust settled, the survivors emerged from the sanctuary, their faces a mix of relief and exhaustion. "Is it over?" one of them asked, her voice trembling. "For now," Brian said, scanning the area. "But this isn't the end." Earl approached, his rifle slung over his shoulder. "You boys just saved a lot of lives, but if those things are still out there..." Brian nodded. "We need to figure out where they're coming from and put an end to this." As the survivors regrouped, Brian and his crew prepared for the next step. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. The survivors rested in the church sanctuary, their exhaustion evident in their hollow eyes and trembling hands. Brian and his crew gathered near the altar, poring over a hastily drawn map of the town. "These things are too organized," Marcus said, pointing to the areas they had already encountered the creatures. "They're not just hunting, they're moving in a pattern." "They're funneling survivors towards certain spots," Brian agreed. "The church, the high school gym, that old factory on the edge of town. It's like they want us to gather in clusters." Tony tapped the map. "We know they're coming from somewhere. We just need to figure out where." Jake nodded. "And then we hit them where it hurts." Earl approached, holding a walkie-talkie. "We've got a lead," he said. "Some of the hunters on the east side spotted a column of those things heading toward the ship. Said it's parked near the quarry." "The quarry," Brian repeated. "That's out in the open. If we're going to hit them, that's where we do it." Tony grinned. "Perfect spot for an ambush." Brian looked at Earl. "Can your people hold the church if we leave?" Earl hesitated but nodded. "We'll manage. Just promise me you'll finish this." Brian clapped him on the shoulder. "We will." The drive to the quarry was tense. The roads were littered with debris and abandoned vehicles, each turn a potential ambush. Brian gripped the steering wheel tightly, his eyes scanning the darkness. "Think this is some kind of invasion?" Jake asked, loading his rifle. "Feels more like a test run," Marcus replied. "If this was the full force, we wouldn't stand a chance." "Then let's make sure they think twice before coming back," Brian said. When they arrived at the quarry, the sight took their breath away. The ship was massive, its surface a sleek black metal that seemed to absorb the moonlight. Strange markings covered its hull, glowing faintly in the dark. Around the ship, dozens of the metallic creatures were moving with purpose, hauling strange equipment and herding a group of terrified survivors into a holding area. "They're capturing people," Marcus said, his voice low. "For what?" Jake whispered. "Don't care," Brian said. "We're not letting it happen." The team quickly formed a plan. Tony would set up explosives near the ship, targeting its landing struts. Marcus and Jake would provide cover fire while Brian worked to free the captives. "Move fast and hit hard," Brian said. "We don't get a second chance." They split up, moving through the shadows as the creatures continued their work. Tony set his explosives with practiced precision, his hands steady despite the stakes. Marcus and Jake took up positions on a ridge overlooking the quarry, their rifles trained on the creatures below. Brian made his way to the holding area, staying low as he approached the terrified survivors. "Quiet," he whispered, cutting through the crude restraints that bound them. "We're getting you out of here." One of the captives, a young woman, grabbed his arm. "There's more of us," she said, her voice barely audible. "In the ship." Brian's heart sank, but he nodded. "We'll get them too. Just stay low and follow my lead." As he guided the captives toward safety, the first shots rang out. Marcus and Jake opened fire, their bullets finding their marks as the creatures scrambled to respond. The metallic clang of rounds striking metal filled the air, and several of the creatures fell, their glowing eyes dimming. The distraction worked. Tony finished setting his charges and retreated to the ridge, detonator in hand. "All set," he called. Brian turned to the captives. "Get to the trucks and wait for us. We'll handle the rest." The survivors nodded and ran, disappearing into the night. Brian joined his crew on the ridge, his rifle at the ready. "Blow it," he said. Tony hit the detonator, and the quarry erupted in fire and smoke. The ship's landing struts buckled under the force of the explosions, and the massive vessel tilted precariously. Sparks flew as the creatures scrambled to stabilize it, their glowing eyes flickering in panic. "Light 'em up!" Brian shouted. The team unleashed a hail of gunfire, cutting down the creatures as they tried to regroup. The ship groaned under its own weight, its hull cracking as it listed to one side. Suddenly, a deafening roar filled the air. A section of the ship's hull slid open, revealing a massive, spider-like machine. Its glowing red eyes scanned the quarry, and it let out an ear-piercing screech before charging toward the ridge. "What the hell is that?" Marcus yelled, firing at the creature. "Doesn't matter," Brian said, grabbing a grenade from his vest. "We take it down." The team focused their fire on the machine, their bullets sparking off its armored body. Tony tossed a grenade, the explosion rocking the creature but failing to stop it. "It's too strong," Jake shouted. Brian gritted his teeth. "Keep firing." As the machine closed in, Brian spotted a weak point, a cluster of glowing nodes near its abdomen. "Aim for the nodes," he yelled. The team adjusted their fire, and the creature let out a pained screech as the nodes exploded. It staggered, its legs buckling, and finally collapsed in a heap of smoldering metal. The battle was over, but the ship still loomed. "We need to finish this," Tony said, holding up the last of his C4. Brian nodded. "Let's end it." As Tony prepared to rig the explosives, a strange voice echoed from the ship, speaking in a language none of them understood. The team exchanged uneasy glances, but their resolve didn't waver. "Whatever it is, it's not staying," Brian said. With the charges set, the team retreated to a safe distance. Tony hit the detonator, and the ship erupted in a fiery explosion. The shockwave knocked them off their feet, and when the smoke cleared, the vessel was nothing but twisted metal. Brian looked at his team, battered but alive. "We did it," he said. But deep down he knew this was just the beginning. The fiery wreckage of the ship lit up the night sky like a burning monolith. Smoke billowed upward, carrying with it the acrid stench of scorched metal and charred electronics. Brian and his team stood at the edge of the quarry, breathing heavily, their faces smeared with grime and sweat. "That was too close," Marcus said, slinging his rifle over his shoulder. "But we did it," Jake added, a weary smile breaking through his exhaustion. "We stopped them." Tony stepped forward, wiping his hands on his pants. "Yeah, but what the hell were they? Those weren't aliens. They were machines. And that ship? That wasn't some spacecraft from another galaxy. It was built here." Brian stared at the wreckage, his mind racing. "You're right. This wasn't an invasion, it was a test. Someone wanted to see how we'd respond." Their radios crackled to life, breaking the uneasy silence. A monotone, almost robotic voice came through. "Attention. Unauthorized personnel are advised to vacate the area immediately. Government response teams are en route. Do not interfere." "Too late for that," Marcus muttered, glancing at the others. "We need to move," Brian said. "If the government's coming, they'll lock this place down. And they're not going to like that we were here." The group made their way back to their truck. But as they climbed in, the sound of approaching helicopters filled the air. Black silhouettes appeared against the faint glow of dawn. Military choppers, their spotlights piercing the darkness. "We've got company," Jake said, gripping the dashboard. Brian floored the gas, the truck roaring to life as they sped away from the quarry. Behind them, the spotlights swept over the wreckage, illuminating soldiers rappelling down from the helicopters. "Think they'll come after us?" Marcus asked, looking back. "They've got bigger problems right now," Brian replied. "But let's not stick around to find out." They drove in tense silence, the weight of what they'd just experienced hanging over them. When they reached Brian's house, the first rays of sunlight were creeping over the horizon. Inside, they found the survivors they had rescued huddled together, their faces a mix of fear and relief. Earl stood near the window, his hunting rifle still in hand. "Did you get it?" he asked as they walked in. Brian nodded. "The ship's gone. It's over. For now," Tony added. Earl frowned. "What do you mean, for now?" Brian explained their discovery, the machines, the ship's construction, and the undeniable fact that it had been made with materials from Earth. "This wasn't an alien attack," he said. "Someone built those things. Someone sent them here." Earl's face darkened. "So, what? This was a test? A way to see how we'd handle it?" "Exactly," Tony said. "And whoever did this is still out there." The room fell silent as the survivors processed the implications. Then, the young woman Brian had rescued at the quarry spoke up. "I heard them," she said softly. "Inside the ship. They weren't speaking English, but it didn't sound alien. It sounded programmed." "Like AI?" Marcus asked. She nodded. "They didn't just want to kill us. They were studying us, analyzing how we reacted, how we fought back." Brian clenched his fists. "Whoever's behind this just made a big mistake. They think they can use us as guinea pigs? Not on my watch." The rest of the day was a blur. The survivors trickled out, returning to what was left of their homes. The team stayed behind, cleaning their weapons and trying to piece together what had happened. That evening, the news began to trickle in. The government had cordoned off the quarry and labeled the incident a natural disaster. The official story claimed the ship was a rogue military experiment gone wrong, but Brian and his team knew better. "It's a cover-up," Jake said, tossing the remote onto the couch. "They don't want people to know the truth." "And we're supposed to just sit here and let it happen?" Marcus asked, his voice rising. "No," Brian said firmly. "We're not. We're going to find out who's behind this." Tony leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful expression on his face. "We've got connections," he said. "People we can reach out to. If anyone knows what's going on, it's the guys in the shadows." Brian nodded. "Then that's where we start. We find out who built those machines, who sent them, and why. And when we do, we make them regret it," Marcus finished, a grim smile spreading across his face. As the night wore on, the team began to plan their next move. They knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but they were ready. They had faced the machines and won. Now it was time to face the people who had sent them. Brian looked around the room at his friends, his brothers. They had been through hell together, and they would do it again if it meant protecting the people they cared about. "This isn't over," he said. "Not by a long shot." Days after the battle, the town began to show signs of recovery. The wreckage from the alien ship had been removed, and the military presence was overwhelming. Checkpoints had been set up on major roads, and drones patrolled the skies. The government's official narrative, a rogue experiment, was being pushed heavily in the media, but the locals knew better. Brian and his team weren't about to let the truth stay buried. They spent their time quietly investigating, using their military contacts and skills to gather intelligence. Each night they convened at Brian's house, poring over maps, intercepted transmissions, and every shred of evidence they could find. One night, Tony slammed a folder onto the table, a triumphant grin on his face. "Got something," he said, sliding the folder toward Brian. Inside were photographs of the ship before it was destroyed, as well as schematics that looked eerily familiar. "These designs," Tony continued, pointing to a blueprint, "match up with a facility out in Nevada. Black site kind of place. Top secret. Nobody's supposed to know it even exists. How'd you get this? Marcus asked. Tony smirked. Let's just say I called in a favor. Brian studied the schematics, his jaw tightening. So this is where they built them? Looks like it, Tony said. If we want answers, that's where we need to go. Jake crossed his arms. You're talking about infiltrating a black site. That's suicide. Not if we plan it right, Brian said. We've faced worse odds before. Over the next few days, the team prepared for the mission. They gathered supplies, studied the facility's layout, and came up with a plan. When the night of the operation arrived, they were ready. Using a borrowed van, they made their way to the outskirts of the Nevada desert. The facility was surrounded by high fences, surveillance cameras, and armed guards. This place is locked down tight, Marcus whispered, peering through binoculars. Good thing we brought the big guns, Brian said, patting his rifle. They waited until the early hours of the morning when the guards were least alert, before making their move. Scaling the fence was the easy part. Avoiding the cameras and patrols took every ounce of skill they had. Once inside, they found themselves in a sprawling complex of interconnected buildings. The air was thick with the hum of machinery and the faint buzz of electricity. This place gives me the creeps, Jake muttered. Stay focused, Brian said. We're here to find answers. As they moved deeper into the facility, they came across a laboratory filled with rows of humanoid machines. The resemblance to the aliens they had fought was uncanny. Holy, Marcus breathed, staring at the machines. This is where they made them. Tony examined a nearby console, his fingers flying across the keyboard. They weren't just making them, he said. They were programming them, training them. For what? Brian asked. Tony hesitated, then pointed to a screen. It displayed a list of targets. Cities, towns, even military bases. For a full-scale assault, he said grimly. Suddenly, alarms blared throughout the facility. Red lights flashed, and a voice echoed over the intercom. Unauthorized personnel detected. Initiate lockdown protocol. Time to move, Brian shouted. The team bolted, weaving through the maze-like corridors as guards closed in. Gunfire erupted, and the air was filled with the deafening roar of combat. They fought their way to an exit, but before they could escape, a massive armored machine stepped into their path. Looks like they saved the best for last, Marcus said, raising his weapon. Light it up, Brian yelled. The battle was fierce. The machine was faster and stronger than anything they had faced before. It absorbed bullets like they were nothing, its glowing eyes locked onto them with chilling precision. Tony rigged an explosive and hurled it at the machine's legs. The blast sent it toppling to the ground, giving the team just enough time to escape. Outside, the desert air was cool and quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos they had just left behind. Did we get what we needed? Brian asked, gasping for breath. Tony held up a flash drive. Everything's on here. Plans, blueprints, even names. We'll know who's behind this. Back at Brian's house, they plugged the flash drive into a laptop and began combing through the data. What they found was more shocking than they could have imagined. The machines weren't built by a rogue government faction or a private corporation. They were part of a project funded by a shadowy international organization. Their goal, to test humanity's resilience in preparation for a much larger event. This wasn't just about us, Tony said. They're planning something global. Brian leaned back in his chair, a determined look on his face. Then we need to stop them. How? Jake asked. We're just 4 guys. We've got the evidence, Brian said. We expose this. Let the world know what's really going on. And if they try this again, we'll be ready, Marcus finished. As dawn broke over the town, the team sat together in silence, each of them lost in their own thoughts. They had fought off the machines and saved their town, but the battle was far from over. Somewhere out there, the people behind the attack were planning their next move, but so were Brian and his team. This isn't the end, Brian said, looking at his friends. It's just the beginning.